The clock on the wall of the Reactor 1 control room stopped at 15:37 on March 11, 2011. No one fixed it. No one ever returned to do so. That morning, Hiroko Watanabe woke up early in Nami, a town of 21,000 people just 5 miles from the Fukushima Daiichi nuclear power plant. She prepared miso soup, tucked away her youngest son's blanket, and set aside the laundry she would wash at the end of the day. It was an ordinary Friday in northeastern Japan, at the start of a spring that had not yet fully arrived. For the people in Nami, Futaba, Okuma, and the dozens of towns lining the Fukushima coast, the relationship with the plant was the same relationship you would have with any structure that has existed for so long that it simply goes unnoticed. It was just there. It had been there since 1971. It generated electricity for millions of homes. It was part of the landscape, much like the cedar hills and the flooded rice fields that reflected the gray March sky. At 1446, the earth began to move. The Great East Japan Earthquake, as it would come to be known, was a magnitude 9.0 quake, the most powerful ever recorded in Japan and the fourth most powerful in the history of the planet. The epicenter was located 40 miles off the coast of the Miyagi Prefecture at a depth of 18 miles. The energy released was equivalent to nearly 600 million Hiroshima-sized atomic bombs. The ground shook for approximately 6 minutes, an eternity when you feel that the very world beneath your feet should not be moving. The reactors at Fukushima Daiichi responded exactly as they were designed. Automatic systems halted the nuclear reaction seconds after detecting the tremors. The control rods descended. Fission stopped. In the control room, the operators finally breathed a sigh of relief. They had been through drills for this. They knew what to do. And for a few minutes, it seemed as though everything was under control. What no one had adequately simulated, however, was what would come next. The tsunami arrived at 15:35, 49 minutes after the earthquake. A series of waves up to 45 feet high struck the Fukushima coast. The seawall protecting the plant had been designed to withstand waves of up to 18 feet. Someone, decades ago, had made a calculation. They had chosen a number, and now that number was being devoured by a wall of water nearly 3 times its size. The external power supply had already been severed by the earthquake. The emergency generators, which were supposed to keep the cooling systems running, were installed in the basements and lower levels of the complex. In seconds, they were flooded. One after another, they stopped. Without electricity, there was no cooling, and the reactor cores, even after being shut down, continued to generate residual heat, a heat that had nowhere to go. Here begins the part of the story that the Tokyo Electric Power Company, TEPCO, would take years to fully admit. In 2012, an independent investigation commission from the Japanese parliament concluded, in explicit terms, that the Fukushima accident was not a natural disaster. It was, in the words of the report, a profoundly man-made disaster. The result of collusion between the government, regulators, and TEPCO, and a culture of obedience that prevented known risks from being addressed. That report exists. It was published. But it was largely ignored in the international debate, which preferred the simpler narrative that the tsunami destroyed the plant. What the report documented is this. Since at least 2008, engineers within TEPCO itself had calculated that a tsunami of the magnitude that hit Fukushima was possible. They conducted an internal study. That study was presented to the executives. The executives decided that acting on those estimates would be too costly, inconvenient, and disruptive to the plant's operating schedule. The study was archived. The protection was never upgraded. Back in the control room on the afternoon of March 11th, the operators were working in the dark, literally. With no reliable instrumentation and no proper communication with Tokyo, they were trying to understand what was happening inside reactors they could not see. The plant manager, Masao Yoshida, was making decisions based on fragmented information, in a situation for which no training had adequately prepared him. In those first hours, TEPCO and the Japanese government fought a silent and devastating conflict over which path to take. Injecting seawater into the reactors was a drastic and irreversible measure. It would mean the end of those units forever. There was pressure to wait, to try other solutions, to preserve the equipment. Yoshida was ordered not to inject seawater. Even so, he did it. He disobeyed a direct order because he understood that the alternative was far worse. That act was recorded. Later, he was internally sanctioned, even though his decision likely prevented an even greater catastrophe. Reactor 1 exploded at 15:36 on March 12th. It was not a nuclear explosion, but a hydrogen explosion. Yet it was equally terrifying to those witnessing it. A television station's camera captured the moment. A plume of white smoke rising in slow motion as the building's upper structure dissolved into the air. The world watched, and what the world saw was the confirmation of something many hoped they would never see. Reactor 3 exploded on March 14th. Reactor 2 suffered severe damage the following day. Reactor 4, which was down for maintenance and not operating, caught fire in its spent fuel pool. 4 reactors in simultaneous crisis, a situation unprecedented in the history of nuclear energy. Hiroko Watanabe was no longer in Nami when the first explosion occurred. Authorities had ordered an evacuation within a 3-kilometer radius on the night of March 11th, then expanded it to 10 kilometers. She got in the car with her children and drove to relatives' homes in Nihonmatsu, 60 kilometers away, thinking she would return in a few days. She only took important documents and clothes for 3 days. She did not return for more than 11 years. About 154,000 people were evacuated from the exclusion zone around Fukushima. The evacuation itself killed people. It is estimated that more than 2,000 people died during or as a direct result of the evacuation, mostly elderly people and hospital patients who did not survive the forced transfer. The tsunami had killed nearly 20,000 people on the Japanese coast. The plant, due to radiation itself, killed a much smaller number, and that contrast sparked decades of debate about which is more dangerous, the atom or the fear of the atom. This is one of the most difficult questions that Fukushima brought to the table, and it has no easy answer. In Tokyo, 250 kilometers from the plant, Prime Minister Naoto Kan woke up on the morning of March 12th, knowing that he could face a scenario where it would be necessary to evacuate not only the immediate area, but potentially a much larger area, including the capital. He asked nuclear physicist Shunsuke Kondo to calculate the worst-case scenario. The report Kondo delivered was so terrifying that Kan later confessed that he could not sleep for days. The document was classified and not made public until 2012. It described the possibility of evacuating an area 250 kilometers around the plant, which would cover virtually the entire Tokyo region. This did not happen. But it did not happen because things stopped getting worse at a specific point, not because there was a clear plan to prevent them from getting worse beyond that limit. The workers who remained at the plant during the crisis became known as the Fukushima 50, although the actual number was higher and fluctuated over the days. They were technicians, operators, and engineers who chose, or were assigned, to stay behind while their colleagues were evacuated. They worked in shifts in environments with high levels of radiation, with insufficient protective equipment and without adequate sleep. They knew that what they were doing would have consequences that only time would reveal. Some wrote letters to their families before entering the damaged buildings. Some of those letters were later published. One of the workers, identified only by the surname Matsumoto in news reports, told a reporter months later that what disturbed him most was not the fear of radiation, it was the silence. The plant had been a place full of sound, of machines, of movement, of people. After the tsunami, it was a place where the wind whipped twisted structures and nothing else moved. It was like working inside something that had ceased to be alive. Outside the exclusion zone, life went on with the peculiar strangeness of those who know that something terrible is happening a few miles away, but cannot see it, cannot measure it with their senses, and are unsure what it means for their own bodies. In the city of Fukushima, 65 kilometers from the plant, parents decided whether or not to send their children to school. Farmers watered their crops without knowing whether those plants could be sold or would be discarded. Ranchers watched their animals and waited for instructions that came in confusing and contradictory doses. The Japanese government set a safety limit for radiation exposure that was criticized by some scientists as unnecessarily high and by others as unnecessarily conservative. The exclusion zone was drawn in perfect circles on the map, without taking sufficient account of the wind and rain patterns that distributed the contamination unevenly. Some areas within the circle were safer than others that had been left outside it. The map did not say that. The town of Itate, 40 kilometers from the plant and outside the initial evacuation radius, received rainfall immediately after the explosions, which deposited significant amounts of radioactive cesium on the ground. For 3 weeks, residents lived normally. They planted crops, went out into the streets, and breathed, while contamination accumulated around them. The evacuation order came on April 22nd, 41 days after the accident. The mayor at the time, Norio Kano, said in an interview years later that the feeling was one of having been abandoned by the state at the moment when guidance was most needed. The world responded to Fukushima in ways that revealed as much about politics as it did about physics. Germany announced that it would shut down all its nuclear power plants by 2022, a decision that increased its dependence on coal and gas in the following years, and which energy analysts still debate whether it was sensible from an environmental standpoint. Japan shut down nearly all of its reactors for inspection, increasing its imports of fossil fuels at enormous economic cost. Other countries, particularly in Asia, continued or accelerated their nuclear programs, calculating that the risks were manageable with the lessons learned. Cleanup efforts in Fukushima began immediately and are still ongoing. Workers in protective suits removed contaminated soil layer by layer in the communities around the plant, filling black bags that were stacked in fields that became mountains of black plastic, visible even from satellite. More than 13 million cubic meters of contaminated material were collected. The problem was, and still is, that there was no place to permanently store that material. Those black bags still exist, some degrading, others leaking, waiting for a solution that the Japanese government has not yet fully found. Inside the damaged reactors, molten fuel, called corium, had descended through the pressure vessels and partially penetrated the concrete below. 13 years after the accident, TEPCO has still not managed to remove that material. Radiation levels inside the reactors are so high that they destroy the robots sent in to conduct inspections. The robots simply stop working. Then, new robots are sent in. The removal of the molten fuel, originally scheduled to begin in 2021, has been repeatedly postponed. The current forecast is that the complete decommissioning of the plant will take between 30 and 40 years from today. In 2023, after years of intense international debate, Japan began releasing into the Pacific Ocean the treated water that had been used to cool the reactors and had accumulated in more than 1,000 tanks within the complex. The water underwent a filtering process called ALPS, which removes most radionuclides but not tritium, a hydrogen isotope that is technically unfeasible to separate from water on a large scale. China banned imports of Japanese seafood. Korean fishermen protested. Scientists were divided over the actual level of risk. Meanwhile, the ocean continued to receive the water. Hiroko Watanabe returned to Nami in 2022 after the Japanese government lifted the evacuation order for parts of the city. She found the house where she had lived with her family partially in ruins, not from radiation, but from neglect and the passage of time. Weeds had taken over the garden. Wild boars, which had multiplied in the exclusion zone during the years when humans were absent, had broken the windows. The clock in the kitchen still showed the time of the earthquake because no one had changed the batteries. She did not stay. She said the town felt like a museum to a life that no longer existed. The population that returned to Nami in the years after reopening was only a fraction of those who had left. The young people did not return. The schools that reopened had only dozens of students where there had once been hundreds. Doctors, shops, the everyday life that makes a community what it is, did not reconstitute itself in the same way just because radiation had dropped to levels considered safe. A town can be decontaminated and still remain dead. There is a Japanese concept, furusato, that has no perfect translation into other languages. It is something like the place of origin, the homeland, the home we carry within us. For the people of Futaba, Okuma, Namie, and Itate, the furusato had been contaminated, not only physically, but in a sense that goes beyond the physical. The place exists, the land is still there. But the life that made that place what it was, the continuity of generations, the cemeteries visited on special days, the Matsuri, or summer festivals, the hiking trails that grandparents taught their grandchildren. All of that was disrupted in a way that removing cesium from the soil cannot repair. Masao Yoshida, the plant manager who disobeyed orders and pumped seawater into the reactors, died in July 2013, 2 years and 4 months after the accident, of esophageal cancer. TEPCO claimed that the disease was unrelated to his exposure to radiation during the crisis. Many did not believe it. The question remains technically unanswered, which is exactly the kind of uncertainty that defines the relationship between Fukushima and the health of the people who were there. What Fukushima changed in the world is difficult to measure precisely, but impossible to ignore. It changed the debate on nuclear energy at a time when the world urgently needed low-carbon energy sources to tackle climate change. It put the fear of the atom and the fear of global warming on the same battlefield, two legitimate fears that point in opposite directions when it comes to energy policy. It did not resolve either of those fears. On the contrary, it added complexity where the world needed clarity. Fukushima was not Chernobyl. The number of direct deaths attributable to radiation is much lower. The contaminated area is geographically more limited. The response was more organized and more transparent as time went on, although not clear enough in the decisive early hours. But the comparison with Chernobyl, which automatically arises in any conversation about Fukushima, is itself a sign of something. That humanity has built a technology whose accidents have their own names, names that span decades and never quite become completely part of the past. The tsunami of March 11, 2011 killed 19,747 people along the northeast coast of Japan. Entire cities were wiped off the map. The port of Kesanuma caught fire while it was still being flooded, an image that seemed impossible and yet was real. In Ishinomaki, the second most affected city, nearly 3,500 people died. In Rikuzentakata, a single pine tree survived where an entire forest had once stood. It was called Ippon Matsu, the miracle pine. It became a symbol of survival before dying due to the salinity of the soil and having to be artificially preserved, which transformed it into a symbol of something much more ambiguous. The Fukushima Daiichi plant was part of Japan's response to the 1973 oil crisis, when the country, lacking its own energy resources and dependent on imports, decided to invest heavily in nuclear power. In 2011, Japan generated about 30% of its electricity from nuclear power, with plans to increase that figure to 50% by 2030. Those plans no longer exist in the same form. Japan's relationship with the atom, already complicated by the memory of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, became even more complex. There is one last thing that needs to be said about Fukushima, something that the numbers, reports, and energy policy analyses do not fully capture. In the weeks after the accident, when the situation at the reactors was still uncertain and the workers who remained on site did not know what they would face, some of them wrote messages to their families. One of those messages, released by a worker who survived and wanted it to be known, simply said, "I'm fine, don't worry, I'll do what I can." It was the language of someone who didn't know if he was really okay, but wanted others to believe he was. It was the language of someone who knew he might not have another chance to say anything. Today, the exclusion zone around Fukushima Daiichi is partly inhabited, partly deserted, and in a slow process of return that could take decades to complete, if it ever does. The damaged reactors are still there, encased in containment structures, with molten fuel still inside, awaiting technology that may not yet exist to be safely removed. The ocean off the coast of Fukushima continues to receive treated water from the tanks, which continue to be filled by cooling water that is pumped in continuously. The cycle is not over. It has only slowed down. When we look at Fukushima, we are forced to ask ourselves a question that is not about nuclear physics, risk management, or energy policy, even though it involves all of those things. It is a question about what happens when we build things we do not know how to destroy, when accidents produce consequences that span generations, when today's exclusion zone is tomorrow's map. We built Fukushima Daiichi to last 40 years. The waste it produced will last for thousands. This asymmetry between the life of a plant and the life of what it leaves behind is the silent core of everything that happened in March 2011. and it remains the silent core of every nuclear plant in operation in the world right now. There are other stories like this, buried in other dates, waiting to be excavated. The past does not warn us when it arrives. There are other stories stored in dates that time tries to erase. Every era has its epicenter,